The night it happened, I remember standing at the window with a coffee in my hand, staring at the quiet street outside. It was supposed to be one of those peaceful evenings after a long week, the kind where my wife curled up on the couch with a blanket. My son worked on his model cars, and the hum of our ranch lights made the world feel safe. But peace doesn't last long when you live under the thumb of an HOA that thinks it owns your soul. And that night, when the flashing red and blue lights lit up my driveway, I knew something had snapped. Not just in them, but in me. The knock came hard. 3 heavy thuds, like someone was trying to break the wood clean off the hinges. My wife, Sarah, froze mid-sentence, her face draining of color. She whispered, "It's them again, isn't it?" I didn't need to answer. We both knew. The HOA had been circling us like vultures for months, sending fines for nonsense, our porch light being too bright, the grass growing half an inch over regulation, my son's basketball hoop leaning slightly toward the street. I'd brushed them off, thinking they'd eventually move on. But when power-hungry people smell defiance, they come back sharper, hungrier. And this time, they had brought cops. I opened the door slowly, careful to keep my voice calm. 3 officers stood there, hands near their belts, eyes cold and rehearsed. Behind them was Greg Martin, the HOA president, his smug smirk lit by the glow of the patrol car. He had the look of a man who thought he'd won. "Evening," one of the officers said, his tone flat. "We've received a complaint about code violations on your property. We'll need you to step outside." My son Michael came to the doorframe, his teenage eyes wide with fear and anger. "Dad, why are cops here? We didn't do anything." His voice cracked, and that sound cut through me like glass. I turned to him and forced a smile. "It's okay, son. Go sit with your mom. I'll handle this." But inside, my blood was boiling. Handle this. I'd been handling their harassment for months, swallowing my pride to keep my family safe. But this was different. I looked at the cops, then at Greg. "You called police for a basketball hoop, for a porch light, for grass?" My voice was calm, almost too calm, but my heart was pounding so hard it hurt. Greg stepped forward, puffing out his chest like a rooster. "This community has rules. You don't get to ignore them just because you think you're above everyone else." His words dripped with spite. And then he leaned closer. "And maybe, just maybe, this will teach your family a lesson about respect." That was it. That was the line that flipped the switch in me. I'd kept my cover quiet for years, blending into civilian life. No one in this neighborhood knew what I really did, where I went every morning when I left before sunrise. Why sometimes I came home with eyes heavy from more than just exhaustion. To them, I was just another homeowner, another man they could push around. They had no idea I was an FBI agent trained, armed, and connected. And in that moment, watching Greg smirk behind the shield of those cops he thought were his personal enforcers, I realized something. They weren't just messing with me. They were threatening my family. And that I could never forgive. The officers tried to play their role, telling me they had to inspect my backyard, citing anonymous complaints of unsafe conditions. My wife called out from the living room, her voice trembling. "Unsafe? Our backyard has roses and a swing set." What kind of nonsense? I raised a hand, telling her silently not to say more. She was scared, and she had every right to be. These men were here because someone wanted to break us down. I stepped onto the porch, closing the door behind me. "You got a warrant?" I asked the lead officer. His jaw tightened. "We don't need one for a community compliance check." I tilted my head, studying him the way I'd studied suspects across interrogation tables. "You sure about that?" I asked, my voice dropping lower, sharper. The shift in tone made him hesitate, just enough for me to know he wasn't as confident as he acted. Greg, though, didn't notice the change. He laughed, loud and cruel. See, you're not special here. You think you can scare them? They work for us. This is our neighborhood, and we decide who belongs. Something inside me snapped. I took a step closer, my eyes never leaving Greg's. Greg, let me explain something. You think these officers are your muscle, that your little HOA badge gives you power. But tonight, you've made a mistake. You came to my house, threatened my family, and tried to use the law like your personal hammer. I paused, letting the silence stretch. The thing is, I am the law. The words hit harder than I expected. The officers looked at each other, confused, and Greg's smirk faltered for the first time. I pulled out my wallet, flipping it open just enough to show the badge I swore I'd never use against neighbors. The badge I'd kept tucked away to keep peace. But tonight, peace was over. Their eyes widened, and the lead officer actually stepped back, his face paling. "You're FBI," he muttered. Greg stuttered, his confidence crumbling. "Why you can't just—" "That's not— Oh, it's real." I cut in, my voice like steel. "And now this entire stunt of yours just turned into harassment, misuse of law enforcement resources, and targeted intimidation. You think you're untouchable? Greg, you're about to find out what untouchable really means." Behind me, I could hear my wife gasp softly. My son whispered something I couldn't catch, maybe relief, maybe awe. But I kept my eyes locked on Greg, memorizing the way his face drained of color. He had poked at us for months, certain we were powerless. Now he was realizing he'd picked a fight with the wrong man. And I knew then this wasn't going to end with just tonight. This was war. Not just for me, but for every family they had bullied, fined, and broken down. I wasn't just going to protect my own anymore. I was going to burn their entire empire of control to the ground, piece by piece, until the word HOA in this neighborhood meant nothing but shame. And as I stood there, the night air sharp in my lungs, I swore one thing. Greg Martin had no idea the storm he had just unleashed. The night after, I showed my badge. Sleep slipped through my fingers like wet sand. Sarah sat on the edge of our bed with the lamp low, her hands twisting the hem of her pajama top until the fabric creased white under her nails. Michael tried to stay stoic, but I caught him staring at his old basketball hoop like it had somehow betrayed him. The police had left in a hurry once they realized what they were up against. And Greg had slunk back to his SUV with a face that looked like someone had taken a bite out of his ego. But the real war wasn't over. If anything, it had only begun. Showing my badge was the spark. Now I had to decide how to use the fire without burning everything I loved down with it. In the quiet hours, I started making lists, the only way I know: methodical. Relentless, names, dates, paper trails. Complaints that had been filed anonymously that always seemed to come from the same group of houses on Maple Street. Payments for legal fees that didn't match any legitimate invoices. A pattern formed like a map of a place designed to trap people. Fines that started small and grew if you pushed back. Committees that approved each other's petitions, and a board that used fear more than rules. The more I looked, the more I realized Greg wasn't acting alone. He was the loudest mouth of a club that profited from punishment. They called it community standards. I called it extortion with polite stationery. The thing that kept me steady, though, was not the paperwork. It was the way my family moved through the days after that night, fragile, careful, like glass that had been wrapped too many times and still had the hairline cracks. Sarah stopped gardening for a week because she said the roses reminded her of how exposed we'd felt. Michael stopped inviting friends around. He worried the HOA would send someone to inspect his model cars or his drawings. That kind of fear is small but corrosive. It eats at you in moments you don't expect. Soccer games at the grocery store, while you're fixing dinner, I saw it in the way Sarah hovered near the bedroom door when I left for work, then relaxed after I was gone, as if my leaving tested something in her all over again. I also did something I rarely allowed myself to do. I asked for help. Not from the Bureau in some big official way that would involve press releases and subpoenas, but from people I trusted outside of work, the retired judge who'd been my neighbor 2 blocks over, the lawyer friend who owed me a favor, an old partner who now taught criminal justice at the state university. Not because I needed to use their names, but because I needed the quiet counsel of people who'd seen similar poison spread through communities and knew how it ate from the inside. They reminded me to be surgical. Evidence first, exposure second, protection always so. I began to collect. I asked neighbors one by one, behind closed doors, to tell me their stories. Some refused at first, eyes darting, worried about retaliation. Others let out long breaths I hadn't realized they'd been holding for years. Mrs. Alvarez, whose grandfather had bought his house 50 years ago, showed me a stack of notices she'd paid without complaint because it was easier. Mr. Carter, a mechanic, admitted he'd once been fined for leaving his truck in the driveway overnight. The fine had been almost enough to cover a month of his mortgage. Each confession was a chisel bit, slowly taking off the thin crust of silence that Greg's people had forged. I pulled public records, which thankfully for me don't lie. HOA, meeting minutes, board votes, and the corporate filings of the management company they used. The numbers were the part that made my blood quicken. Unexplained transfers, consulting fees to companies run by people who sat on the board, invoices for community beautification that matched no actual purchases. I photographed stacks of envelopes, scanned receipts, then transcribed conversations, always making sure people understood their rights to speak and sign statements. You learn, after a while, to treat a person's memory like a witness box. It needs coaxing, a timeline, confirmation. People started bringing me old emails and texts they'd forgotten existed. The pattern grew from anecdote to proof. At night, when I would tuck Michael into bed, he'd ask the same small questions that meant everything. Are they going to come back, Dad? Will they take our house? I had no right to promise him anything I couldn't absolutely guarantee. But I promised the one thing I meant with my whole chest. No one will make you feel small in your own home. Not while I'm here. He stared at the ceiling after that, eyes reflecting the moonlight like little searchlights. I imagined the look on Greg's face when he realized my family wouldn't bow. It filled me with a mixture of grim satisfaction and a deep, ancestral sorrow. Revenge tastes noble in the heat of it. But it claws at the heart, too. We began to push back in public ways that didn't look like an FBI operation. I organized a neighborhood meeting under the guise of community concerns, booked the small church hall on Friday night, and kept the flyers simple. Open forum, HOA practices, and community rights. The turnout surprised me. People came with pizza boxes and printed notices, with eyes full of that same quiet fear I'd seen at my own dinner table. I let voices speak. I didn't lead with names or accusations at first. I let the stories knit into a chorus. When one woman described having her mailbox padlocked because she'd missed a $25 fine, several heads dropped and a murmur spread like a current through the room. That murmur was the sound of power shifting, but Greg didn't sit still. He called me coldly. Politely warned me to stop slandering the community. He used words he thought would scare me. Lawsuits, libel consequences. His threats were a smokescreen. Behind them, I could sense panic. The tighter he squeezed, the more crooked his empire became. He made a mistake I'd learned to watch for in criminals. He underestimated the human cost of his own actions. For every person he hurt, I found a new ally willing to step forward. For every hush he enforced, an old document resurfaced. It was a slow, grinding machine, tedious and sometimes infuriating, but It was one we could all feed with truth. There were nights I wanted to do something. Dramatic something that would scorch Greg's name across town like lightning. But rage without restraint can become what you're fighting. I couldn't let the hunger for immediate payback drown the purpose of justice. So I took the long route instead. I prepared folders that would one day be impossible to ignore. Financial spreadsheets, sworn statements, a timeline of harassment. I reached out to a journalist from the regional paper, professional, someone who believed in accountability and passed along enough to pique his editor's curiosity without exposing my sources. The press could do what my badge alone could not. It could make this a community issue rather than a private vendetta. All the while, my family began to breathe a little easier. Sarah took up her roses again, pruning with a fierce tenderness. Michael slowly started to bring friends back over, tentative at first, then with the relaxed bravado only teenagers have. We ate dinner together more often, an unspoken pledge to hold our house as a place of warmth against the coldness outside. I taught Michael how to string a fly rod one Saturday, the rhythm of casting a small, patient meditation. In those moments, the idea of revenge shrank down to something almost human, not a spectacle, but a reclamation. We weren't just retaliating. We were healing, and yet, beneath the small victories, I knew the real test was coming. Evidence could build a case, and stories might sway neighbors and editors, but people like Greg don't crumble easily. They lean on fear, on bluster, on the friendships they've built with people hungry for control. What I had to do next required patience and cunning, but not of the dark kind. It needed to be flawless, lawful, and above all, undeniable. The plan was in my head, the pieces falling into place like a map I had drawn in sleep. I had one chance to turn this from a scandal into an end. The days after the meeting felt like standing on a shoreline watching a distant storm approach. There was movement in the air, a sense that things were shifting, but the real impact hadn't yet arrived. People who had been silent for years began to speak in small, stubborn ways. A neighbor left a stack of receipts on my porch. Someone slid a USB with scanned documents into my mailbox at midnight. Each gift felt like a secret passed between allies in the dark. It was a slow revolution built out of tiny acts of courage. And every time I saw evidence appear where there had been only fear, I felt both more hopeful and more exposed. The more proof we held, the more desperate Greg and his circle became. They would not go quietly. One morning, I found my car keyed in the HOA parking lot. The scrape ran like an accusation across the passenger door, crude and public. Michael was with me that day. He'd come along because he liked to watch me sort through the mess of paperwork at the town office. He saw the scratch, and his face tightened in a way I knew meant rage simmering under restraint. "They did this?" he asked, voice low. I nodded, keeping my jaw steady. "Yes, but that's petty, and petty people leave traces." I looked him in the eye and said something I hoped would stick. "We don't answer pettiness with pettiness. We answer it with proof." He nodded, but I could tell he wanted to run out and confront whoever did it, to make them pay in the only currency teenagers understand: immediate retaliation. Instead, we logged the damage, took pictures, and filed it with the police. Small acts of procedure became armor. Greg escalated too, though not always with the bravado he once wore. There were letters sent to homeowners implying legal trouble if they spoke to me. Veiled warnings about associations and community harmony. He tried to use their fear of paperwork against them, muttering about lawsuits as if his threats were something more than bluster. It was the classic bully move. Make people scared of cost and hassle so they won't act. But for every letter, I had a folder. For every veiled threat, a testimony of someone who had already stood and refused to be cowed. The journalist I'd nudged earlier ran a piece of careful. balanced article that didn't name names but outlined suspicious financial dealings in the HOA's leadership. The story generated more calls than I expected. People who'd hidden in the wings suddenly felt the safety of numbers. One by one, they came forward with small, damning pieces, invoices that matched no service, check payments to shell companies, signatures that didn't quite line up. It was like watching a wall crumble when you finally find the seam that makes it fall apart. The editor wanted a second, deeper piece and asked for nth-record interviews. I provided a few, careful and composed, and let the journalist know I had more if needed. The press did what 100 private conversations couldn't. It legitimized the suspicion and put public eyes on Greg's empire. That kind of light changes how people behave. But light can also burn bridges. Greg's supporters pushed back publicly, calling the article sensationalist and accusing me of trying to weaponize the community. I expected that. The thing about fighting someone who's built a life on manipulation is that they'll always try to flip the narrative to make themselves the victim. The more attention we drew, the more complicated the social web became. There were neighbors who had been quietly complicit because they benefited discounted dues, preferential treatment, social status. Some of them left our meetings. Others watched from the sidelines. I learned, in those weeks, the small pain of discovering that not everyone you've smiled at over the years will stand with you when the ground shakes. It's a sobering lesson about human nature. One night, after a board meeting that I didn't attend but that everyone talked about the next day, Sarah came to me with a face that had been up and down 1,000 emotions. She'd gotten a call at work from a woman who'd once been one of Greg's friends. Someone who hadn't yet made the leap to speak publicly but wanted to tell a story in private. The woman said, quietly, that she had seen Greg sign something he shouldn't have, and that she was terrified he'd find out she'd told. Fear is contagious that way. Sarah listened while I sat on the kitchen counter, the house humming around us like a living thing. When she finished, she sighed and said, "People are scared, but they're starting to choose." I kissed the top of her head and felt a flicker of gratitude so sharp it hurt. She had been the one to hold down the home front, to keep our kids calm, to remind me to eat, sleep, and come upstairs without burying myself in work. Her bravery was quiet but essential. As the months unfolded, I alternated between small, public victories and private surgical strikes. In one case, a vendor I suspected of being a front company agreed to meet alone with a friend of mine who ran a legitimate contracting business. The man fumbled through explanations, his voice coated with the kind of practiced vagueness people use to hide paperwork. My friend recorded the meeting legal in our state as long as one party is aware, and it confirmed what I'd suspected. Shell invoices. Money funneled from the HOA into accounts that led back to Greg's inner circle. We had a paper trail that would hold up in court. But evidence is not justice, it's only the map to it. The next step was to build a case that the county prosecutor couldn't ignore. I reached out, quietly, to a detective friend who still worked local cases. He listened, asked pointed questions, and suggested a briefing that would need to be airtight. I prepared everything from sworn statements to scanned checks. And we walked through the timeline with the kind of methodical calm I'd used for so many investigations. When the detective finally nodded and said, "This is enough to open an inquiry," it felt, for a second, like payback. But there was no exultation, only the hard work of knowing what came next. Depositions. Subpoenas, the slow, public dismantling of a persona. During the inquiry, Greg fought with a kind of desperate vigor I'd seen before in bad men who felt their throne wobble. He rallied the remaining faithful, hired attorneys, launched his own social media campaign alleging harassment, and painted himself as the defender of neighborhood values. It was theater, but theater that could sway jurors or neighbors unversed in financial forensics. That's when I learned the importance of translation. Complex financial maneuvers are meaningless to many unless you can explain them simply. So we made stories of people Mrs. Alvarez, who almost lost her savings. The Carter family, who had to choose between fines and groceries' human faces to the dry spreadsheets. Empathy turned numbers into narrative and narrative into outrage. None of this was clean. There were late-night calls when threats were made against our family, anonymous notes left in the garden, and a suspicious break-in at a storage unit a week after we'd turned over a stack of documents to investigators. The Bureau, unsurprisingly, does not take kindly to threats against its personnel or their families. I called in favors to make sure our house had an extra set of eyes on it when needed. I didn't like that life had become guarded. None of us did. But the safety net felt necessary, like a shield around a place that had already suffered enough. The slow burn of the investigation did something unexpected to our family. It pulled us closer. Facing an outside force, even one so small and petty as an HOA board, clarified priorities. We ate dinner earlier. We talked more. Michael started playing the guitar again, the same songs he loved in high school. And Sarah joined a community garden group to rebuild the friendships frayed by fear. In small ways, we reclaimed the life Greg had tried to make impossible. That reclamation wasn't revenge, was restoration. And sometimes restoration is the best revenge there is. When the prosecutor finally scheduled interviews and the county announced an official inquiry into the HOA's finances, the neighborhood breathed out like it had been holding its breath for years. People who'd been afraid of paperwork showed up at hearings with handwritten notes and trembling voices. They spoke about fines and intimidation, about petty rules used as weapons. Watching them testify, watching their courage turn private wounds into public truth, I felt a weight lift. It was not victory, yet far from it, but it was the unmaking of the lie that the HOA's leaders had been champions of the community. They'd ruled through fear, and fear, when named and explained, loses its teeth. The first hearing was chaos. The community center was packed tighter than I'd ever seen it. Folding chairs lined shoulder to shoulder, people standing along the walls. Even a few pressed against the windows to listen in. The air was heavy with anticipation, nerves, and the quiet buzz of whispered conversations. Sarah sat beside me, her hand gripping mine so tightly her knuckles turned white. Michael was at home with my sister. This wasn't the place for him. He'd begged to come, but I couldn't let him see the ugliness of grown men trying to wriggle out of accountability. Some wounds a father tries to shield his son from, even when the world insists on showing them. Greg arrived last, striding in with 2 lawyers at his side and that same smug smile plastered on his face. It was smaller now, forced, but still there, like he thought he could bluff his way through sheer arrogance. The room quieted as he passed, people glaring, whispering, some even spitting under their breath. He adjusted his tie and looked around as though he still owned every soul in the building. For a moment, I almost admired the sheer gall of a man who could walk into a room filled with people he'd harmed and still act like king. Almost. The prosecutor opened with a summary. Misuse of funds. Harassment, intimidation, possible fraud. It wasn't flashy, was clinical, precise, but it landed like thunder. People shifted in their seats, nodding, murmuring. Then came the testimonies. One by one, neighbors stepped up to the microphone and poured out their stories. Mrs. Alvarez, voice trembling, spoke about paying fines for illegal plants in her garden, her roses, planted by her late husband. Tears streaked her cheeks as she explained how she'd paid out of fear, terrified they'd take her house. The room was silent as she finished, then erupted into applause that the moderator struggled to quiet. Then came the Carters, who spoke about being fined hundreds for their teenage son parking his car in front of their own house. They talked about choosing between paying fines and buying groceries some weeks. Their words weren't polished, but they didn't need to be. The raw truth in them was sharper than any lawyer's argument. I sat back, letting their voices fill the room. This wasn't about me flashing a badge anymore. This was about them reclaiming dignity that had been stolen piece by piece. The beauty of it was how human it all sounded. Quivering voices, awkward pauses, the occasional angry curse slipping out despite warnings to remain civil. It was messy, but it was real. And real has a way of cutting through the lies. When it was my turn, I stood slowly. Greg's eyes locked onto mine, his smirk twitching. His lawyers whispered frantically, trying to predict what I'd say. I cleared my throat, feeling the weight of every neighbor's eyes. "My name is Daniel Walker," I began, keeping my voice steady. "Most of you know me as just another homeowner. You don't know me as the man who goes to work before sunrise and comes back late, tired. You don't know me as the man who files reports on organized crime and fraud. But that's who I am. I'm an FBI agent." Gasps rippled through the crowd, though some had already guessed after the incident at my home. I continued, "I don't say that to intimidate anyone. I say it because the people on this board, Greg Martin and his circle, thought they could misuse power without consequence. They thought they could bring police to my home, harass my family, and threaten us into compliance. That night, they made the mistake of forgetting that the law exists to protect, not to be twisted into a weapon." I held up a folder thick with papers. "I have here documented evidence of financial irregularities, fraudulent invoices, and accounts linked back to board members. This is not hearsay. This is fact. And while I've gathered this as a neighbor, I've also gathered it as an investigator who knows the law. You don't need to trust me. The numbers speak for themselves." I placed the folder on the table in front of the prosecutor, the sound echoing like a gavel. For the first time, Greg's smirk faltered completely. He shifted in his chair, jaw clenched. His lawyer stood, sputtering about overreach and personal vendettas, but the murmurs in the crowd drowned him out. People weren't buying it. They'd lived the truth. They'd paid it in checks and tears and fear. No lawyerly spin could erase the bruises this community had endured. After the hearing, Sarah and I walked to the car under the pale glow of the parking lot lights. Neighbors stopped us, shook our hands, whispered thank yous. Some cried, hugging Sarah like she was a sister who'd fought beside them. I felt a deep swell in my chestnut. Pride, exactly, but relief. Relief that the silence had broken, that fear no longer had the same grip. But I also knew Greg wasn't finished. Men like him don't fold. They dig deeper, lash harder, try to scorch the earth as they fall. And sure enough, the retaliation came swift. The very next day, several neighbors received urgent violation notices for nonsense infractions trash cans left out 5 minutes too long. Curtains deemed unacceptable, even a child's chalk drawing on a driveway labeled graffiti. It was Greg's last stand, a pathetic attempt to reassert dominance. But this time, people didn't pay. They didn't cower. They brought the letters to me, to the prosecutor, to the journalist. They laughed bitterly as they held them up, evidence of a desperate man scrambling to cling to power. Still, beneath the laughter, there was tension. Greg was cornered, and cornered men are dangerous. One evening, as I was pulling into our driveway, I noticed a car parked just a little too far down the street, engine idling. A man inside pretended to check his phone, but his eyes flicked up at me in the rearview mirror. Surveillance, intimidation, old tricks I'd seen in the field, now being used against me in my own neighborhood. I didn't confront him, not yet. I documented, recorded, logged. I knew better than to act rashly. But that night, when I tucked Michael into bed, he asked a question that stilled me. "Dad, what if they tried to hurt us?" His eyes were wide, searching mine for something solid to hold on to. I sat on the edge of his bed, brushed the hair from his forehead, and said, "Then they'll learn the same thing everyone else is learning. We don't break. We fight back. Inside, though, I carried a darker truth. This wasn't just about fines anymore. It was about power, control, and men like Greg who would rather destroy than lose. The fight was reaching its peak, and the next moves would decide everything. The nights felt heavier after the HOA's ambush. And though I had taken steps to strike back, the wound they carved into my family was still bleeding. My daughter Emily had nightmares almost every evening, waking up screaming about cops banging on the door, about men with guns storming her safe space. My wife Julia did her best to soothe her, but I could see in her eyes that she carried the same fear. Every slam of a car door outside, every shadow crossing our front window, made them stiffen. It wasn't fair, and it wasn't something I could allow to continue. If they thought sending cops would break me, they had underestimated the storm they'd just unleashed. I started keeping a closer eye on our street. I documented every suspicious car that lingered too long, every HOA patrol vehicle that crept by at odd hours. I noticed patterns: the same black SUV parked near the clubhouse on nights when the board was supposedly meeting. The same 2 officers who had shown up at my house now walking casually in the neighborhood, chatting with Karen, our HOA president, as if nothing had happened. Their arrogance sickened me. They really believed they could cover their tracks, erase their actions, and intimidate us into silence. But silence wasn't in my DNA. The FBI had taught me patience, control, and precision. I wasn't going to storm into a meeting guns blazing or file a weak complaint that they could sweep under the rug. No, I would dismantle them piece by piece, strip away their power until their empire of control came crashing down. That night, when Julia sat beside me on the couch, whispering that she wasn't sure she could take much more of this stress, I took her hand and promised, "It ends soon. I swear it ends with us standing tall and them crawling." The next morning, I began phase 1 of my plan. I reached out to an old contact from my bureau, Desa's cyber analyst, who owed me a favor. I asked him to quietly pull financials on the HOA board members. Within 48 hours, the data landed in my inbox, and what I saw was enough to make my blood boil. Karen and her cronies had been funneling HOA funds into security contracts, padding their pockets while charging residents higher fees. They weren't just bullies with rules, they were thieves, stealing from hardworking families while pretending to enforce community standards, with proof in my hands. The temptation to move fast was strong, but I knew timing was everything. I needed them overcompetent, sloppy, so I decided to stir the pot. At the next community meeting, I showed up unannounced. The clubhouse was packed with residents, most of them too afraid to question the board. But I could see frustration etched into their faces. Karen stood at the podium, spouting about compliance sweeps and protecting property values, her smug smile making my stomach churn. When she opened the floor for questions, I rose. The room went quiet as every eye turned to me. Karen's smile faltered just for a moment. "Karen," I began, my voice calm but sharp, "can you explain why our HOA fees have doubled over the past year while our services have gotten worse? Why our security budget is through the roof, yet the only people benefiting seem to be your friends?" A murmur rippled through the room. Karen cleared her throat, fumbled for a second, then tried to mask it with her usual arrogance. "Mr. Miller, if you have concerns, you can submit them through the proper channels." I didn't sit down. I did 3 times. No response. So now I'm asking here, in front of everyone, where's the money going? The crowd stirred, neighbors exchanging uneasy glances. Some nodded, emboldened by my words. Karen's face reddened. "That's enough. If you can't respect the process, we'll have to what?" I cut in, stepping closer. "Send your fake cops again? Intimidate me into silence?" Gasps filled the room. Karen's mask slipped for a second before she forced a laugh. fake cops. That's absurd, but it was too late. Seeds of doubt had been planted in the minds of every resident sitting there. They were beginning to see the cracks, the lies. Karen slammed the gavel and abruptly ended the meeting, but I left with a smirk. I'd drawn blood. That night, retaliation came swiftly. A letter was shoved under my door, typed in bold letters, "Back off or your family pays." My hands shook as I held it, rage burning through my chest. Julia read it, her face pale, and whispered, "They won't stop until they destroy us." I hugged her tight and whispered back, "Then we destroy them first." Phase 2 began the next day. I filed a sealed report with a trusted friend still active in the bureau. Every fraudulent transaction, every shady security contract, every falsified compliance citation was included. I knew it wouldn't stay quiet for long. Karen and her board thought they were untouchable, but they were about to learn what it felt like when the real law came knocking. Still, I couldn't shake the image of my daughter's frightened eyes. This wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about survival. About giving her back the childhood these monsters had stolen. The stakes were higher than ever, and though I had the upper hand, I knew the board wouldn't go down without a fight. The war had officially begun, and I was done playing defense. The moment the bureau formally opened an inquiry, the neighborhood changed in ways I hadn't expected. It wasn't just the visible things, the sudden hush at the clubhouse, the empty chairs at meetings where attendance used to be a point of pride. It was the tiny, dummy, brittle sounds, shutters closing a fraction sooner, dogs barking longer. The way neighbors pretended to water their lawns while watching the street for faces they once trusted. The air tasted different, like a storm that had already announced itself and was now circling. And in the middle of it all was my family. Trying to find a rhythm between fear and the stubborn need to live. Julia was my anchor and my conscience in those days. She moved through the house with a kind of deliberate softness, making space for the kids to be children, even when the world wanted to make them small. Michael, with his skateboard leaned against the garage, tried to be braver than he felt. He'd come back from school and throw himself into projects, earbuds in, pretending the noise of the outside world wasn't a heavy hum in his chest. Emily, younger by 3 years and impossibly earnest, asked more questions than a child should. Why do people lie? Why do they want to hurt us? When I crouched to her level and told her the truth in words she could hold, that some people try to control others to hide their shame, she nodded solemnly. Like a little judge keeping a record. The HOA, cornered, turned from arrogant to vicious in a way that made my skin crawl. Their responses became increasingly desperate. Forged notices mailed to households. Anonymous social media posts accusing me of fabricating evidence. And a particularly sick attempt where someone sent an envelope to our front porch with pictures of our family taken from across the street. The photos had curiously intimate angles, a week of a stranger's patience spent watching us live. Emily found the envelope and shrieked. My stomach dropped into a place I can't describe without tasting iron. Whoever had done it wanted us afraid. Whoever had done it wanted us quiet. That night, I sat with Julia on our back steps under the porch light and made a decision that settled something inside me. I would not let fear become our home. I had built a life around protecting others, and now my duty felt both public and private. I called in the favors that come from having worked decades in difficult places. I asked for discreet surveillance on our house, for patrols that looked ordinary but were there to deter ugly hands. The Bureau assigned an unmarked car that sat 2 houses down sometimes, and a contact who could check plates and movements, without drawing headlines. It felt invasive to bring that kind of enforcement to our quiet cul-de-sac, but safety, I told myself, is not vanity, it's survival. At the same time, I kept the pressure on Greg's network. We coordinated with county prosecutors to issue subpoenas for bank records and contracts. We presented the financial web watchfully stitched together. To anyone who would listen, the journalist who'd been careful but persistent, a state auditor who took a personal interest, and neighbors who had finally decided fear was a poor trade for dignity. Watching the legal machinery wind up was less cinematic than I'd imagined in my head. A lot of forms, a lot of signatures. Long days in waiting rooms, but each step felt like a small nail hammered into the rotten boards of the HOA's house of cards. Then came the night the HOA pushed a little too far. They'd been spreading a rumor, anonymous notes, text chains that on their face seemed harmless. But the undertones were poisonous. Allegations about me using my position for personal revenge. Claims that made my name smell like corruption. The stories were designed to erode trust in me, to paint the community's focus on Greg as some kind of vendetta. They wanted the moral outrage turned back on me. It was cowardly, but effective for those who didn't know the truth. I met with the prosecutor the next morning and felt something shift in her eyes. "They're trying to flip the narrative," she said, quietly. "They're terrified, and terrified people lash out." She slid a stack of call records across the table. "We've traced several of the anonymous numbers to a VoIP that routes back to the HOA's management company. We're close." The document smelled like victory and old paper, and for a weird second, I wanted to laugh. Instead, I felt the heavy weight of responsibility. Every move would be scrutinized now. We had to be flawless. One evening, the board convened a special security meeting at the clubhouse, an excuse to rally the remaining faithful and try to rewrite the story. They invited a local security consultant who'd do a slide presentation on neighborhood safety, a spectacle meant to rally the troops and paint us as a destabilizing force. I didn't attend. I watched from the sidelines through the journalists' live updates and neighbor reports. But even at a distance, the theater reeked. The consultant, a slick man with an easy smile, spun tales of looming danger and the need for stricter enforcement. He sold fear like a subscription plan, but truth, buried or muddy, has a way of finding light. A neighbor who'd once been on Greg's side, a man named Will's Hood, had kept his head down because he'd profited from preferred contractor assignments, came to me one afternoon with his hands shaking. He'd been watching the financials for years, he said, afraid of what he'd find. "I can't look at myself in the mirror anymore," he said, voice fracturing. Harris handed over bank statements and emails that placed the consultant directly in the money trail. He'd taped conversations out of guilt, recordings he'd never meant to make public. "I'm sorry I didn't speak up. I'm sorry it took this long. I took the files with irreverence. I reserve for living things." Harris's testimony landed like a hand on Greg's throat in the hearings that followed. The county's subpoena power moved faster. The security consultant was revealed as a shell contractor with no real credentials, paid through layers to hide the rent being siphoned away. Greg's face, once so sure, now crumpled in depositions. He stammered, pointed fingers, blamed coworkers, but each answer dug the hole deeper. The narrative flipped. The men who'd tried to weaponize process to keep control were exposed as the ones hiding behind paperwork to steal from their neighbors. There were ugly moments. Greg's lawyers tried to subpoena me to accuse me of misusing classified information, to turn the Bureau's involvement into a question of ethics. I took the deposition and answered with the clean precision of someone who knows how to thread truth into law. I did not show temper. I did not grandstand. I spoke plainly about the evidence and the ways a community can be co-opted by the wrong kind of leadership. The legal barrage was exhausting, but it was necessary. The best kind of work is often the one that looks like boredom to the untrained eye. Careful, patient, correct. In the end, what broke him wasn't a dramatic takedown. It was small things, a canceled contract, a bank freezing accounts because of suspicious activity. A board member deciding immunity was not worth the shame. Neighbors who had been too scared to speak now submitted affidavits with shaking hands. The county filed charges: fraud, embezzlement, extortion through misuse of authority. Greg and his inner circle were placed under indictment. It was a surreal moment. A man who had stood in my doorway with a smirk now had to face the same legal system he'd tried to twist for his own use. When the judge signed the arrest warrants, I walked home slowly and found Julia in the kitchen. The kids doing homework at the table like everything in the world was normal. She looked up at me, and in her eyes I saw exhaustion, relief, and something else that made my throat tight: quiet pride. Michael went over and threw his arms around me, and Emily ran up and pressed her cheek to my leg like a small anchor to shore. I held them both, feeling the surge of all the nights we'd feared and all the small evenings we'd chosen dinner over. Dread. We didn't celebrate loud or gaudily. Instead, we planted new roses in the backyard that weekend. Julia and I kneeling in the dirt while the kids clumsily helped, planting roots and trimming dead stems. The simple ritual felt like a reclaiming. The garden would grow whether our enemies praised it or not. The house no longer felt like a place under siege. It felt, slowly, like a house that had weathered something and come out on the other side. There would be trials, appeals, and the messy business of restitution. Justice would be a long road, one that wouldn't erase the nights of fear or the petty cruelties. But as I watched my family move through the ordinary moments of breakfast and school runs and lazy Sunday afternoons, I felt a steadiness I hadn't known for months. The HOA's empire was broken, but more importantly, the community had learned something vital: that silence breeds power, and truth, when chosen together, is stronger than any bully's pretense. The morning of the trial arrived like a storm that had been building for months. Heavy with tension, but oddly quiet inside our home. Julia made pancakes, though I could tell she was too nervous to eat. And Emily insisted on packing me one of her little drawings in my briefcase, a stick figure family holding hands under a giant sun. For luck, she whispered, as if she knew luck was something fragile, something we might need more than ever. Michael, who had grown into his courage through all this, simply hugged me and said, "Make them pay, Dad." Walking into the courthouse was like walking into an arena. On one side, Greg and the remaining board members sat with their attorneys, looking worn, pale, and stripped of their former arrogance. Karen wasn't there. She had cut a deal weeks earlier, trading testimony for reduced charges. That betrayal alone had rattled Greg, and the hollowness in his expression showed it. For so long, he'd strutted around the neighborhood like a king. Now he looked like a man clinging to the last scraps of control. The courtroom filled with neighbors, people who had once bowed their heads at HOA meetings, who had signed checks without question, who had been too afraid to speak. Today they came to see truth laid bare. Some carried resentment in their eyes, others relief, but all of them carried hope. They wanted to see the board stripped of the power they had wielded like a weapon. The prosecutor opened with a story of fraud and intimidation, laying out the stolen funds, the fake compliance sweeps, the sham security contracts. It was cold, factual, undeniable. Then came Harris, his voice trembling but steady enough to recount years of corruption, how he'd been complicit by silence until guilt ate him alive. His recordings echoed through the room, damning the board in their own words. I watched Greg squirm, his jaw tight, his hand fidgeting with a pen until it snapped in two. When it was my turn to testify, I stood and walked to the witness stand with deliberate calm. The defense tried to rattle me, pressing on my career, accusing me of using bureau contacts for personal revenge. I answered simply, truthfully, without embellishment. I didn't need to bend the law, I told the jury. The HOA board bent it themselves. My job, my duty, was to make sure their crimes didn't stay hidden. Not just for me, but for every family who paid their dues in good faith and was bullied into silence. I could see jurors nodding, the weight of the evidence written across their faces. By the time closing arguments were made, the verdict felt like a formality. Still, when the foreman stood and declared, "Guilty on all counts," a rush of air filled the room like the whole neighborhood had been holding its breath for years and finally exhaled. Greg's face twisted, fury breaking through his mask. He turned to me, spitting venom with his eyes, but there was nothing left for him to say. The bailiff cuffed him, and for the first time, Greg was truly powerless. The same man who once sent cops to my door, who shoved threats under it, was now led away in chains. Justice didn't always look cinematic, but in that moment, it was more satisfying than any movie could have been. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, cameras flashing, neighbors clapping me on the back. I gave no speeches, offered no grand words. Instead, I walked straight to my family waiting at the steps. Julia's eyes glistened as she hugged me, Emily's little arms wrapping around my waist. Michael grinning with a pride he didn't try to hide. We didn't need the world's applause. We just needed each other. The weeks that followed felt like a rebirth for the neighborhood. Without the HOA's chokehold, people began to breathe again. Yards once cited for noncompliance now bloomed with gardens of every shape and size. Neighbors gathered in driveways for barbecues, no longer afraid of fines for parking on the street. The clubhouse, once a throne room for bullies, became a community center again, a place for birthdays and laughter instead of threats. One evening, months later, I sat on the porch with Julia as the kids chased fireflies in the yard. The air was warm, soft with the hum of crickets. She rested her head on my shoulder and whispered, "Do you think it's really over?" I thought of Greg sitting in a cell, of Karen hiding behind her plea deal, of the system that had finally worked the way it should. I thought of Emily's nightmares fading, of Michael finding his voice, of neighbors reclaiming their dignity. And I nodded. "It's over," I said. "At least the worst of it. What comes next is healing." She smiled, tired but genuine. "You kept your promise." That night, as the stars spread across the sky, I realized revenge had never been the point. It wasn't about crushing them simply because they tried to crush me. It was about restoring balance, about standing when others couldn't, about making sure my children grew up knowing that bullies, no matter how powerful, can be brought to justice.